Bom dia a todos. É um prazer receber hoje o professor Calhoun, que fará uma exposição, como o título da obra dele, da conferência dele diz, A Social Science Manifesto. O professor Brito dirá algumas palavras a respeito da atuação e da obra dele e depois passaremos a conferência sem maiores delongas.
Welcome to FAPESP for this talk by Professor Calhoun, who is the director of the London School of Economics and Political Science. Professor Calhoun has been the director of the London School of Economics since September 2012, and he calls his job, quote, "the dream job for anyone who cares about social science, global issues, and bringing better knowledge to public debates." Professor Calhoun came to England from the United States, although he studied anthropology at Manchester and took his Doctor of Philosophy in Sociology and Modern Social and Economic History at Oxford. In the United States, he was president of the Social Science Research Council and taught at the University of North Carolina, Columbia, and NYU, where he was most recently a university professor of social sciences and director of the Institute for Public Knowledge. Professor Calhoun's publications bring together theory and empirical research across several disciplines. Among his books on politics and social movements are Neither Gods Nor Emperors, Students and the Struggle for Democracy in China, and The Roots of Radicalism. He has also published extensively on nationalism and globalization, secularism, religion and the public sphere, economic and technological change, critical social theory, and the history of social science. Describing his approach to academic work, Professor Calhoun says, "We must set high standards for ourselves, but in order to inform the public well, not to isolate ourselves from it." It's a great honor to have Professor Calhoun here, also because we are in the final steps of negotiating a collaboration agreement between FAPESP and the London School of Economics, so that we will be able to offer support for researchers in the state of São Paulo who will have exchange and collaborations with colleagues at the London School of Economics. The colleagues at the London School will be supported by the London School. And this is part of an effort that FAPESP has been doing for a number of years to develop opportunities for researchers in São Paulo to have joint research projects with colleagues elsewhere in the world. Of course, London School of Economics is a very important elsewhere in the world for us. And the idea is that through those exchanges, researchers in São Paulo and their colleagues at the London School of Economics will be able to reach the point of working together to conceive, prepare and submit joint research proposals to the research councils in the UK and to FAPESP in such a way that those proposals would allow the collaborations to be self-sustainable in time. That's a strategy that FAPESP has been using in many fields, and we are happy to have this very, very special opportunity in the fields related to economics, social sciences, and the humanities. So now, without further ado, I give the floor to Professor Calhoun. Professor.
Thank you very much. It's great to be at FAPESP, and it's great to be in São Paulo. And it's great to be in the presence of a number of LSE alumni here in the group, as well as colleagues from a range of institutions. And what I'm going to do is to offer a general perspective on social science in the form of an outline of a manifesto. I should say that the actual document, there is a manifesto that is in the process of completion with a French colleague, Michel Viviorca, and will appear jointly and is longer. So there's selection out of a somewhat longer document for what I want to talk about here. The idea of a social science manifesto, though, is to affirm the importance of social science, but also the fact that if social science is important, then social scientists have some obligations to do it in ways that meet that importance and potential public value, and that may call for change. The notion in an immediate way grew for my co-author and myself out of discussions about the ways in which people kept trying to defend social science in the face of criticism or in the face of more funding for technology-based research or natural sciences, but to defend social science entirely in its existing structures, to defend it as though it wouldn't change or that it wasn't compelled to change by the discussion, rather than to engage it in that broader way. So, with no further ado, let me see if I can make this work. Yes. Okay. Now, it may seem obvious, and to social scientists, it's mostly not going to be contested, but society is real. The fact that it can be contested, however, is evident. The British Prime Minister, Margaret Thatcher, famously remarked how, in her view, it wasn't real, right? It was an artificial construct. Individuals were real. And this was, in some sense, either accumulation or artificial. Thatcher channeled Jeremy Bentham, who wrote not about society, but about community, and the idea of a community interest, that it was artificially constructed and not real, that what was real were the interests of individuals. I think that social science affirms the reality of society, but it has gotten itself sometimes into confusions by affirming this so forcefully that it reifies society, that it begins to treat society too much as a kind of thing, and not in terms of the many different kinds of relationships, not with enough attention to the fluidity, not with enough attention to the internal tensions. And I won't go on at length about it, but a key point is to see how much we have failed to resolve in hundreds of years of thinking about this, the tension between society in the singular and societies in the plural. The extent to which we often talk about society with the assumption that nation states define societies, and we take as somewhat for granted the internal unity of the societies in each of these nation states. But then we also speak of global society, and we know that different kinds of social relations cross borders more or less easily, and that there is a question about just what society at large is. Much of the stuff, the real work of social science, is actually studies that pick up particular variables that do some of the creation of society in this. So the individuals and society become opposed in much of our discussion, and a challenge for us is to see them as mutually interdependent and mutually constituting, not one before the other. I won't give a kind of introductory sociology lecture about this at this point, but it's a significant issue. And it has to do with ways in which we conduct empirical research, with what our measurements are, with how we think. And let me give just a simple example. Dramatic revolution almost in economics over the last 35 or so years was to restructure economics with microeconomics primary from decision makers up. Macro had previously been much more ascendant. A simple example, when I took introductory economics, right, I'm pretty old, so that was 40-some years ago, right? Macro was seen as primary. Almost all of the major textbooks of economics taught macroeconomics first as providing a context and then took up microeconomic issues. Okay? There was a transformation that started in the 1970s. Right? It was a link between microanalysis and mathematicization, more intense modeling, the development of better, more sophisticated models, most of which started out as agent-centered models in one way or another. Now, without going any further into the detail of it, what we note is we have two ways of doing things. We don't overcome the opposition and the tension, but we work with it in different ways. Macroeconomics is enjoying a resurgence, both in mainstream and in more heterodox economics now, and has been particularly since the financial crisis of a few years ago, but in recognition of the very large political impacts on economies. So it's apparent that many of the biggest factors influencing economies are not specifically economic, they're political. One of the features of the micro-oriented work was to reduce attention to the political, because it created a stronger sense of an insulated economy based from the individual decision makers up. Now, this is not a criticism of economics alone, because there are similar sorts of issues in a range of fields. My point is that there is a process of construction with consequences, and when we try to start everything from individuals, we have an impact on the overall attention, and we lose sight of some things. We lose sight of some of the very large macro effects, and I'll talk about a few more. We lose sight of whole institutional arenas like politics. We lose sight even of the way in which markets are created when looking at markets as fundamental. The remedy is to be able to look in lots of ways and to challenge and have internal challenge and discourse in the fields. The idea of relationships is itself important, that society not being a thing, right, that society is webs of changing relationships. But the relationships are complicated. They obviously include, and here we have the bias that is more typical of some other fields of social psychology or parts of sociology and anthropology, a bias towards the face-to-face, a bias to understanding relationships as interpersonal, first and foremost. Right? But many relationships are not, even in principle, face-to-face. Market relationships are mediated by markets, often at long distance. You know, who made your shoes, right? Generally speaking, in the contemporary world, it's not a shoemaker that you talked to about your shoes. It is somebody or multiple people in a division of labor at a considerable distance, and you couldn't find out who they were even if you tried. But then you consider the indirectness in other kinds of impacts that are more complicated than who made your shoes. Other kinds of markets, but also something like the way in which surveillance works, the way in which data, which each of us create as byproducts of doing all the ordinary things in our lives, like paying with credit cards, becomes available for various projects of surveillance by governments, of course, and we know about the issues and the fights over US and other spying, but also by credit agencies and by a variety of others, and even sometimes by social science research. Although a problem for social science research is most of this data is not available to researchers. Most of it is organized proprietarily or behind legal walls of secrecy that prevent researchers from doing it. And this prevents critical perspectives from emerging on some of the most basic kind of social relationships in modern society, which are large scale, which go on without our awareness, which are not constructed out of subjective meaning necessarily, but as byproducts, yet powerful byproducts that influence all of us. Now, I won't go into making the point at great length, save to say that if we begin to think of these relationships, we realize we are in relationships of the fairly, if you will, stereotypical or conventional understanding, like the relationships we have with friends or with family members. We look them in the eye, we know them in many different aspects of our lives. We are also in these highly asymmetric kinds of relationships, and relationships which we can know in part only through statistics, only through social science analysis, only through various kinds of aggregate patterns, and that aren't available very adequately to us in everyday personal experience. So social science plays a role in making these evident and in enabling us to even know that they're there. Not necessarily just saying good or bad or something, but that they exist, revealing them. And it does this in ways that become part of almost the infrastructure of modern societies, so that something like compiling GDP statistics then has an impact in a host of ways on the way in which business works, on expectations, on confidence, on policies. In some places it's a policy trigger, inflation statistics, all these sorts of things. Things that can become topics of arcane academic debate under some circumstances. What's the best way to measure something? Become active parts of the society, reciprocally influential. Moreover, these relationships don't come organized into politics, economics, society, culture. Right? We, in forming our academic disciplines, have participated in a process in modern societies of separating spheres of life, to some extent in reality, but even more in ideology. So we, the social scientists, have participated in the idea that politics and economics are somehow two completely different things, that the relationship between the two can only be unjust influence, if money is influencing politics, or interference, if politics is influencing the economy. But think for a moment about the construction that takes place really from the 18th century forward, in which there is a construction of the idea of the economy, which then begins to have a number of effects. It enables certain sorts of analytical clarifications, but it also separates and creates a barrier for understanding some of the relationships between political and economic life, including the extent to which political factors create the conditions for much of economic life. So it plays an ideological role in society, and it gets reproduced in lots of ways. The fact that we have economics as a discipline and political science as a discipline participates in a way in this social phenomena, and absent efforts to promote interdisciplinary connections and to look at core issues, political economy in that case, can make worse rather than better some of these things. And economics has gone through a period of being more insular and less connected, as I already said outside. Or we will speak about civil society as though it is somehow a different social sphere, completely separate. Now, there are distinctions. We can talk about the organizations of civil society that are not state organizations and are not for-profit businesses, and be clear in this sense. But it's interesting how this language over the last few decades made a resurgence precisely as there was a sort of market fundamentalism in some settings as a way to reclaim a sphere of society, but to reclaim it as something different: politics, economy, society. And I think that part of what we need to take on is the integrative whole of these. That doesn't mean that we can't speak in shorthand terms, but we need to be aware of the shorthand when we do this, and aware of the mutual interdependence, that these are relationships in a common way. The language of civil society has gone through interesting history in this regard from the 18th century, when it helped to bring the notion of society into the foreground through various shifts. For the most part, the civil part got dropped and society was spoken of. There was a renewal of the language of civil society shaped by the late years of communist regimes in Eastern Europe, shaped in part by Latin American influences in the era of dictatorships, when there was an effort to point to things that were happening in society and not under state control, and to claim that domain. So there's a historical influence on bringing back the notion of civil society, but then it has its own potentially distorting influence if it implies that this is a place in the real world rather than a perspective on the real world, an issue that we work all the time with in this. Go on. So social science, as I already began to hint, is a facilitator, an enabler. It enables us to understand, the way we often tell our students, but also to make choices. And social science data and research, social science analyses and theories are all involved, among other things, in enabling us to be self-aware, to be conscious as members of society, and to organize that consciousness to make particular choices. The choices can be made in ways that range from large-scale collective decisions in elections or something like that to very specific applied decisions as we organize specific policies or operations in groups and so forth. Social science is caught in the fact that it is part of a project to make us more aware, more conscious of what we're doing, more able to know rather than just follow habits or tradition. But it's partly a description of things that we are not conscious of as we do them, and only partly an account of decisions we make in a conscious way. And it's caught back and forth in that tension. But it contributes to society in crucial ways, and I think very important ways throughout a range of social decisions. So obviously to public policy, and large parts of social science are oriented to that. Sometimes there are critical alternatives that say social scientists have been too oriented to the state. They should be oriented more to social movements, more to NGOs, more to other parts of what's going on. But note the difference between policy formation and behavioral change. You can certainly have a policy to try to generate behavioral change, or you can try to advance a policy by a behavioral change agenda in the so-called nudge tradition that has been popularized, this idea of using various small cues to accomplish changes in behavior on a large scale. It's come out of behavioral economics and other fields recently. But it's important to get that social science is partly informing large-scale conscious decisions. Now, the voters may not understand things as well as we would wish, or they may not vote in the numbers we would wish, and there may be too much apathy, but there are mechanisms like voting for large-scale conscious decisions. There are also lots and lots of mechanisms shaped by social science that influence decisions in other ways. Right? And not just in the area of public policy. Marketing is heavily driven by social science. It's essentially a field of social science. Whether it is social marketing, whether it's marketing of consumer products, whether it is nation states marketing themselves as a kind of nation branding exercise to their own citizens and internationally, and thus participating in this constitution of the national structures and all of this. So we need to recognize that our role cannot be only the role of informing conscious decisions. It has to be also the role of investigating the way in which these less conscious factors work, all the way up to big cultural change. Let me make a simple example of this. Something like as personal as how many children we have, at what age we have children, right? These are shaped by social factors. A wonderful small bit of demographic research showed the extent to which demographic variation in things like age at which women gave birth to their first child, how many children they had, and whether they were married when they conceived their first child, right? All varied more between cities and countryside in every country in Europe before the 19th century than they did between countries. Right? Only in the course of the 19th century did they come to be organized as national patterns, largely following the integration of national media, which created national norms and expectations for what was appropriate family size, whether it was appropriate to be legally married before you had your first child, and so forth and so on. This has changed. And my point of that is the interconnection between the seemingly very intimate and large-scale demographic phenomena, which shapes the relative shortage of children, the absence of children in Europe, and the growth patterns is an important domain in all of this. And the social science inquiry isn't an inquiry into purely social phenomena, as the example of children would suggest, but always one at which there are potential influences from material constraints, economic constraints, physical constraints, but also biology and things that are happening in other arenas, right? So a whole, whoops, lost something there, but it doesn't matter. The rise of social science is a rise rather specific to the modern era. The rise of social science doesn't have a sort of birth date, like, oh, it started in 1750 or something, but it does start in close relationship to a variety of fairly specific changes, and it's thus different from the whole history of social thought and everything that went on before. Partly science, of course, it's just the invention of science is critical to this version of science, social science. And I can't resist throwing in the addition in this point of the importance of claiming science. Social scientists for the last 40 years have had an anxiety about science. And it's partly just that many of us are humanists in some part as well as social science, but it's partly an assumption that claiming science would be claiming a specific set of orientations that would be at odds with us. I think that we've actually been self-defeating in our rather precious arguments about the limits of the language of science, that being critical is crucial, but making a kind of distinction in which we reject science as a dominant and overall language has been damaging to the social sciences in recent years. So science is a basic transformation, but there are a lot of others. The rise of the modern state is preeminent. The state is the single most important conscious consumer of social science knowledge, played a huge role. States pay for social science, federal and local states, but also, though, have huge arenas of use. And we may forget this because we tend to think of social science in terms of the newest knowledge that has just been created in our fields, and sort of forget that almost every bit of data in a labor ministry, a ministry of finance, all these things, is core social science in its history and constitution. So a massive demand function is created by the rise of the modern state, and social science grows in part reflecting it and participating, as I already said, in the way it's developed. Capitalism creates huge sorts of interest. It's not that in general capitalists go around saying, I wish there were more social scientists in the world, but it is the case, right, as I hinted with market research and a variety of other arenas, that part of the rise of social science is shaped by large-scale economic organization in more or less capitalist markets, without trying to go into detail about the discussion of the internal of the markets. That is, the role of social science knowledge, not just in opposing or supporting capitalism, not just in the ideological struggles, but in making it happen, making it possible in a variety of arenas is important, so that you have huge extensions of social science into employee relations or into the structures of economic knowledge that are used by firms as well as by policy actors, and the rise of management schools out of social science background, mostly in the post-World War II era. The issues of exploration of empire and eventually globalization are shapers because they denaturalize the idea of local knowledge, that they denaturalize the notion that the way we are already doing things is the only way they could be done. They raise questions by the mere fact of noticing things are done differently somewhere, and this is a driver of social science and comparative knowledge throughout the early modern period and on into the present, and it continues, and globalization shapes us. Then you add the processes of globalization itself, and you see the engagement in new knowledge production. I mentioned science, but cities, right? The transformations, the scale of social life, something I'll say more about in a moment because it continues into the present day and right here in São Paulo. The rise of cities is a reorganization of society, but it also makes society visible in new contexts. Part of the rise of this social science is a response to it and to the knowledge demands there. Well, so too, transformations of everyday life. A simple idea, just to pin to this, though a powerful and important idea, is a transformation that goes on in the early modern era in the very valuing of everyday life. And I think it continues in a certain way. Most of Christianity's teachings about everyday life were focused on the problems of this vale of tears, of the difficulties and challenges and the promises of redemption after death. Spiritual devotion was very otherworldly. This started to change, particularly in the 17th century. And so in Catholic and then Protestant as well teachings, there was much more emphasis on ordinary happiness. That is, on the ways in which part of what religion did was cultivate ordinary happiness. We see new versions of this in Pentecostal and some evangelical religion today, where the ordinary happiness, the promotion of self-discipline linked to entrepreneurs and small businesses, linked to the survival of migrants, the quite remarkable statistic that almost half of Latin American Catholics who migrate to the U.S. wind up Protestants by the time they get there. This has to do, in part, with services provided by churches. It has to do with migration networks. It has to do with lots of things, right? But one of them is the marshaling of religion as a support for ordinary happiness in this world now. And that's something that continues in a variety of ways and is fought over and argued over in a variety of settings. It also, though, is then linked to the very possibility of a science, in a way that economics once understood itself as a science of happiness, a science devoted to trying to understand, as Jeremy Bentham put it, the greatest happiness, the greatest number. And the idea that this was a positive value in the world, that this could be the most important thing to understand, right? Not the theological status, right? Nor the military power of states, or something, but the greatest happiness was linked to a transformation in the very idea of political legitimacy, as states began to be deemed legitimate on the basis of the well-being of their populations rather than other factors, inheritance or something. We'll go on. Yeah, the secular world, not secularism in the sense of irreligion or anti-religion, but secularism in the sense of processes that are understood to work without reference to anything otherworldly. Okay? Most of what we think of about medicine or the economy, we think of in secular terms, even if we are religious, even if we also pray for our recovery from illness or recession. The presumption is of a variety of this worldly secular processes. This creates an occasion for, and becomes a shaping part of social science. However, among academics, social scientists are the most likely to be secular, not religious, in almost every country in the world as well. But that's not the inherent reason and point. The inherent thing is that we're studying processes for organizing life constructed in relation to secular histories. But secular has a meaning that we aren't apt to. You are more likely to recognize than my fellow English speakers, which is the reference to time, to the century, to the secular as the course of time, the directions of change in the world. So the fact that the word is etymologically linked to the word for century, which is basically Etruscan and Roman history, but I won't go in that direction, is significant because what it orients us to is an idea of the future and the ability and the central role of social knowledge in being a knowledge connecting past, present, and future, and those not being inevitable, those being governed by secular, that is temporal, processes. One of the most important of these in the modern world is the construction of nationalism, the construction of national identities and nation states, and the project of having populations match in some intrinsic way the structures of state, a pre-political foundation to citizenship. I won't go into the details of it, but you will grasp quickly how basic this is to social science. First off, because when we have a panoptic view of the world, it tends to be a view of the world like maps that have pink and gray and other spaces, the different countries neatly demarcated by boundaries. I have to say a distant relative of mine died trying to, in the Paraguay-Brazil War, and they're trying to define one of those boundaries near here. But it's not a trivial sort of, it is a trivial family connection, but it's not so trivial in the larger scheme of the world, in the ways in which wars and all of this make these things, but in which we then naturalize them in maps. And how do we do comparative research? We gather the data, which is organized in these national units. If you get World Bank data, if you get IMF data, I think it comes pre-structured, reinforces this. So we social scientists are participants in an organization of the very view of the world that is in our data in largely national terms. Social movements, though, also are basic. The transformation in which it became possible for people to think they could remake society by their collective action, sometimes seizing control of the state, but often without ever an ambition to seize control of the state, but to make change. And the 19th, 20th, and now 21st century process of the growth and prevalence of social movements, centrally part, constitutive of the very social world we exist in. So all of these things shape a rise of social science, and most of them remain continuously important. Social science, though, takes on some very specific roles now, not just in relation to a long history. Several of these issues that I've talked about, right, are obviously still important. I won't go through and try to make the case to you. I'm going to hope it's kind of obvious that they're important. But they're important partly because of changing structural conditions in all of these things. The ways in which states are shifting in their form, in the extent of their sovereignty, and their ability to manage certain affairs, even to manage things like inflation policy by the conventional tools in a world in which some of those tools have lost efficacy due to international financial dealings. Capitalism, which changed its character. And just to give a sense of why this is not just a background condition. So, in the 1970s, prior to 1975, the vast majority of assets, wealth, in the OECD countries was held in the form of material assets. Okay? About 2/3. By the early part of this century, the vast majority was held in the form of financial assets. That is, tradable paper or electronic assets that did not directly denote any material assets. Well, this is a transformation of capitalism. Capitalism has gone through periods of being more financial, more capital, more industrial. Before, it has different characters in different countries, which may be more industrial or less industrial. But the point is, the social science engagement in trying to understand what the heck is going on. What went on in 2008, 2009? How does this relate not just to inside technical issues, but to broader issues in the period is basic. Urbanization. We now, more than half of the world's population live in cities. When the LSE was founded in 1895, London was just becoming the world's first global city, right, with 1 million people, right? Vastly different from São Paulo in certain ways and other cities of much larger population now, and Greater London itself is now 20 million people. But one of the things this did was change the form of city. Right? Cities used to be like cities look if you go to an opera and you get a rendering of Venice or something. They had a center. They had a sort of stage on which public life happened. All French revolutions in the 19th century involved capturing the Hôtel de Ville. That is, there were visible markers in this public stage of the center of the city. No city works like that now, no major world city. They all are polycentric. They all have a different organization. They all sprawl. They all create different structures. In São Paulo, structures of cheek-by-jowl juxtapositions of rich and poor and populations of other kinds. In a place like Santiago de Chile, segregation of those populations across the city, but in neither of them anything like that classical form of the city. So just to say city is to miss the point of the need for us, if we're to understand society, to have a deeper engagement. The same thing for globalization and all of this. I would, and I won't take the time to do it here, go back to the 1970s and say, we can see a lot of our current world hinging on a set of transitions and transformations in the 1970s that we haven't fully internalized in social science or in society at large that are really important and shape things. The end of a confidence in development, whether in terms of economic development in less developed parts of the world, so-called, the whole issues of dependency theories and all that, but also of the continued progressive development of the rich countries. In many ways, what happened is that a kind of growth stopped and a kind of living on credit started around the 1974-75 recession with the 78 reforms and policies. The petroleum economy changed, right? We remember back to oil was about $3 a barrel before this point, not 100 and something. And you can go through a whole series of changes in this, which I won't. But what I would point is, without social science, we are hampered by not seeing these shifts in the way society is organized, and we therefore fail to understand very well the immediate situations we're in because they have a history, not just an ancient history, but rather proximate relations to earlier events. When the world came to construct its response to the issues of the 1970s in the way it did, right, it led to issues we have now. It's no accident that this is the point for which I cited this transition in structures of finance. Right? The United States was waging the Vietnam War at this period. The Vietnam War was unpopular. In the last 7 years of the Vietnam War, the United States didn't raise taxes to pay for the Vietnam War at all. The Nixon government felt that would be risking problems, and so it issued debt. And this began the secular increase in U.S. debt that is such an issue today, and it goes on. There are these intertwinings. The world's largest sovereign wealth fund in Abu Dhabi was founded in 1975 in relationship to the newly transformed OPEC, which itself came after the Yom Kippur War, which the violence in Gaza that we see today continues, and so forth. We live a reality, right, that we truly can't understand by just looking at our interpersonal relations or just looking at the contemporary statistics, the GDPs and so forth. It needs to be situated in relation to these kinds of proximate changes, because only then can we understand transformations, possibilities, and so forth. Where I want to go from this is to discuss some things happening in the world that are intrinsic calls to social science. I'll just evoke them, and since time's running on, I'll just say, think of climate change, or environmental issues more broadly, or energy issues closely related to them. All of them are material issues in the world. They are all crucially and integrally social science issues, or we will fail to act on any of them. Action in relationship to them is politics, it is economics, it's new kinds of financial instruments, it's social movements, it is a host of social science questions. So the issues of environment become one. Think of health. Right? Health is a macroeconomic factor. Of course, it's a matter of physicians, it's a matter of scientific, don't worry about it, of scientific innovation and so forth, but it is also a matter of paying for it. A bigger and bigger part of the macroeconomic costs in every country, transformations of what goes on, of who gets what kind of health care and so forth, how is primary care delivered, and changes that seem otherwise explicable, like the transformation of China into one of the world's fastest growing and increasingly rich countries, come with a transformation in health, as in other institutional areas of everyday life. So the old Danwei system of work units in China, where people got their health care, like their housing or their kids' education, through their workplaces, has completely broken down. And China is struggling to invent a primary care system for the country. Take care of it. Care for the aged, the very recognition of the populations, the predictable to social scientists, but not necessarily to all policymakers, aging of populations becomes pivotal. So we have a whole series of these issues. Just their importance is a reason for social science to be more centrally on the agenda, but a couple more points. We should recognize that not only are they important, but the response to these issues is largely the construction or reform of social institutions. That throughout the modern era, there has been a process of destruction of existing institutions, for example, of local community relations, of the ability of families to take care of the elders within their family. So migration, for example, disrupts the way in which family works as a social welfare institution. Right? Capitalism, in Karl Polanyi's words, has long had this double movement of disrupting the social conditions on which it depends for its own stability. But then there have been efforts to reconstruct them, the creation of the welfare state or the creation of private insurance companies, the development of entrepreneurial businesses that cater to needs that people have because they've lost other support systems, but also the development of philanthropy and charities. So the process of building, of social reconstruction, is essential. We've just gone through a period signaled by terms like neoliberalism, in which many of the older institutions have been hollowed out, disorganized, undermined in many of the richer countries of the world. Newly rich countries of the world have often not built those new institutions in the first place. So in each place, we have a huge institutional deficit. And so a core issue for the present era is of building institutions. I would take you back to 1968 and remind you that there was a lot of critique of institutions. That is, it's not automatic that we love the institutions we have to take care of us. And if they're not being criticized and transformed, they become obsolete, they become vulnerable, they have crises. But we live in a world with a huge need for institutions. Things like care of the aged are a good example, but so are the issues of building urban institutions in these new cities or dealing with other kinds of concerns. Thanks. It's okay, I'm just going to wind up in any case. This world of institutional deficits is a challenge to the stability of capitalism and a challenge to our ability to make happy everyday lives in a variety of settings. And it's a call to social scientists here, not just to study it and comment, oh my, the world looks pretty bad, right? But to be in a position of being part of this proactive reconstruction. Understanding how institutions work, having experiments, studying the experiments and creating knowledge of the potential in them, doing work internationally that identifies best practices and brings them forward. So social science is called on, it seems to me, to play a very critical role. This is often missed because of the extent to which there is a hope for the new technology that will generate economic growth and solve all of our problems. But it's integral to that, the social science institutional dimension. However, social science is somewhat challenged internally by too much rigidity in our disciplinary structures, by too much tendency to focus on the old intellectual problems that we inherited, rather than to look to these new issues, by the need to develop attention to what I would call problem area focuses of research. So we have disciplines, academic disciplines, economics, sociology, and so forth, are to a large extent quality control devices. That is, they help us raise the standards and quality of their work, circulate methods, critical discussion, peer review. But they are also inherently conservative. They tend to keep knowledge focused where it is. Cross-cutting things, problem areas, working on climate change, working on health, working on financial regulation, working on cities. These draw us from different disciplines to bring different perspectives to our work. Similarly, internationalization is a matter of different perspectives that, as I said at the beginning, sometimes denaturalizes the assumptions about what has to be reality. So if we are to play the role we are called on to play, I think, in this era that hugely needs a restructuring of social institutions, we also have to restructure social science to be as strong at contributing as we can be. And that will include new kinds of research, learning how to work on big data with search algorithms. It will include old kinds of research. Participant observation won't become irrelevant. And it will require imagination. And we had better value bringing the imagination as well as the rigor to these challenges. Thanks.
Thank you, Professor. We have time for some questions.
Thank you. Great talk. Thank you very much. I'm a computer scientist, and I work with databases. And what I found really illuminating because I'm trying to see how I can learn from social scientists in my research, is that you started with data problems such as privacy, availability, and separate, isolated databases that cannot be integrated. And you ended with big data. So can you tell us a little bit more about these issues and how to cope with them to make real transformations in the way social sciences work?
So to try to be brief on this, one thing is the extent to which there are, as it were, socially created, government or legally created barriers to this that I alluded to with proprietary data sets, but there are lots and lots of kinds. So it's not just a technical problem of integrating data sets. It is actually a problem of the social institutional arrangements that create the data, and most of the data is byproduct of social institutional arrangements. So it really does belong, as I think you correctly are implying, in an interface, in an integration between social scientists, computer scientists, lawyers, other kinds of people who are part of this. A second thing is that I am not a believer in the idea that big data and search technologies, sort of inductive research, will drive out theory and replace all role for the questions we're asking. I think there has been a fantasy of big data that has been promoted in some circles in which we will be able to work by radical induction all the time. I just don't think that's true. It will still matter what questions we ask. It will still matter how we structure the inquiry. It creates new capacities, but it doesn't eliminate that importance for the intellectual work, the theory. A third thing in this is that we are at risk of, for want of a better word, fetishizing the data, because we will tend to be so excited by the wonderful conclusions we can find by looking at big data, and it's big, it is fantastically big, that we will think everything is in it. And a danger for social scientists will be to imagine that these big data sources contain all the knowledge we need and want to have, because much of, they will exclude lots of things, and we will tend not to think about them, a little bit like the huge advances in power. I mean, economics really did gain power in the last 40 years, but the gains often obscured politics, as I was saying. Well, in the same sense, being able to analyze those things we can analyze will make us think that more of reality is in those data sets we can get our hands on than will be the case. For example, all of the available big data sets will be biased to their creation in either economic transactions or government administrative processes. So that if we use big data to understand social life, we will have a view in which these loom larger and other things loom smaller. And we need to be attentive to that. That doesn't mean don't use it, it means answer back. Final point is just that this will change also our communication with ourselves, and we have to recognize the extent to which open access and a variety of other issues are issues about how we publish, how we share information with each other, how we work, crowdsourcing, the working in large-scale collaborative teams. An irony of social science is that social science is the, in one indicator, the least social of the sciences, that is the least likely to be based on collaborative research, the most likely to be driven by individual investigators rather than teams. And it's sort of a paradox. Do we all believe in a 19th century theory of individual genius? Do we like working alone? Are we just individualists? But we are way behind all versions, natural, physical, and other science, in the extent to which, if you just measured by the indicator how many articles are co-authored, and with how many co-authors, and how many teams are organized internationally and so forth. So that's also part of this story, because many of the things we'd like to see in these new data environments, we won't be able to do by individual research projects.
Well, first, thank you for an illuminating talk, or if you wish, an impressive marketing of social sciences. Now,
I don't reject that characterization.
But what is the relationship between your view, which is forward-looking and calls, it's a challenge, it's a challenging view. What is the relationship with your view of social sciences and reality of A, social science international organizations, B, social sciences places where the social sciences are thought to be taught?
All right, I like the twist in that last comment. I actually think social sciences do more of this than we give ourselves credit for in the way we present ourselves sometimes. So I think that there is a lot of innovation, there is a lot of forward-looking work, not as much as I would like to see, but I think that when pressed to give an account of ourselves, we often fall back on an account which underestimates that, interestingly, and is more conventional. My first comment and core response to this would be to say, in an expression that may or may not exist in Portuguese, probably does, and may or may not be wise to say after the World Cup, but the best defense is a good offense. And I think that academics in general and social scientists in particular often fail to remember that adage and become defensive all the way down, rather than realizing that demonstrating what you can do, having a good offense, is the best strategy. And secondly, I think in relation to other lines of knowledge, we have the opportunity to be building new kinds of interrelationships. And I don't just mean working in centers on nanotechnology, who has the sociologist of nanotechnology. I mean working in a field of knowledge where the work that we do is really important to some of these other fields, right? But it will only gain that importance if we know enough about what's going on in the other fields to be able to connect it up. And we limit ourselves by this slightly defensive attitude and thinking, well, I'm a sociologist, I shouldn't have to read anything not written by a sociologist. You just have to be out building those connections. That's part of the proactive work that will make us thrive. And the places where social science is now taught, including the LSE and all the others I include in this, all have some biases that are problematic, and many, many good qualities. But we all tend to compartmentalize the work in ways that are counterproductive for its contemporary relevance and its future flourishing.
Thank you very much for this enlightening lecture. It's just a small provocation. Unless I took a short nap during your lecture, I think my statistics that you mentioned capitalism 3 times and socialism not once is true. Would you care to comment?
I think you're probably right. I can take refuge, and I'm pretty sure it's in one of the slides that may have gotten lost, but it would still be true. So I think that one of the big factors of this world that I signaled in a shorthand way by saying, look at the 70s to the present, is the dramatically reduced place of the idea of a socialist alternative. And this is mainly about politics and social change, but it has an impact on social science because it has encouraged a view of what Margaret Thatcher characterized as TINA, there is no alternative, and an inclusion of everything within a common model. And I think we, the social scientists, haven't worked through this well enough. Now, we might work through it by reinventing the left or reinventing socialism, or by doing something else. But it's not a question of our politics, of whether we are individually socialist or individually farther left. It's a question of our thinking about alternative possible social relations. And that's what I meant by the issue of imagination that I just gave lip service to at the end, that I think we are impeded in our social science work by failures of imagination where we don't consider that things could be organized really differently than the way they are, because that gives us a different perspective on how they're organized now, as well as on possible directions of change. Secondly, I think the connections to movements are very important. At the moment, I don't think there is a very important socialist movement in the world. And I say that as someone who has considered himself a socialist my whole adult life. And I'm sorry about it, but I think it's true. I think that there are a variety of movements in somewhat fragmented form that carry on parts of what was once linked together as a socialist agenda, and that part of the predicament of our world is that we are not doing a very good job at connecting, here in São Paulo, movements for housing driven by poor people, movements for environment driven by middle-class people, movements for economic innovation driven by business. That there are different kinds of forces for social change, and at the moment, my sense is they are fragmented, often in tension with each other, and not as effectively integrated as I'd like to see. And social science could contribute to developing visions and accounts and ideas of that integration, or even studying the problem.
Yes. Hello. Thanks very much for your presentation. I was impressed by both the methodological claims and the diagnosis, which I think many critical theorists in Brazil would share. And I think as a critical theorist, I would agree with you that collaboration is the only way to make a meaningful contribution to the science of society. In this sense, I would understand your presentation as having 3 levels. So this is the disciplinary level, the interdisciplinary level, and another level. So disciplinary and interdisciplinary can harm this other level, which is normative. And if I understood correctly, it's something to do with what you call the social. So what would it look like, the social, in its normative claims for you?
Okay. I'm going to slightly change what you say. The 3 levels I think is insightful and correct, and what you call the normative I would call the public. And because I think it is not just having norms, it is not sitting in your study reading John Rawls and articulating a normative theory. And I think, in fact, this is something that has been unfortunate in parts of the critical theory tradition with which I also identify, that the engagement in debates over, do you agree with the late Adorno, on normative questions has often, sort of not been there. What was going on and what the critical theory movement, I think, needs to be is publicly engaged. And so I'd point to the process as well as the norms, so so I don't disagree that it would include normativity and normative debates, but that the important thing is that it involves publicness in some sense. And I think we have real problems with publicness. So a public social science that would inform debates, and that would not necessarily settle them all, right? It's not that the social scientists would be the kings and be able to say this is what society is like exactly, but that illuminating the debates, raising the quality of the discussion, informing sometimes each side in the discussion, so the debate itself is better because it's partly an empirical basis. What I'm sort of saying, informing publicness is important, and that's partly norms. It's partly the empirical, evidentiary basis of public discussion as well. And it's partly the institutional structures that support or fail to support public discussion. And I think that in varying way, and I won't presume to comment on Brazil, among the institutional deficits we suffer are deficits in institutional supports for the kind of public discussion that we would need if we were to make collective decisions about the character of society. Such collective decisions would reflect norms, whatever went in. But they also would reflect an understanding of what's possible and next steps in making it happen. And they depend on the media. They depend on access to information. They depend on public gathering spaces in which people debate. They depend on education. They depend on a variety of things to be able to have the public discussion in which knowledge and normative thinking and imagination can be used to make decisions about things that otherwise are either the decisions of some powerful people without that public role, or accidents. Things that happen without there being a conscious decision, tradition, or byproducts. And so I would call that third level, and I appreciate having the attention called to this idea of the public. I would, as a way of signaling something about it, I think we have too widely a notion of publication that is a really limited engagement with the public, which is more or less we write an article in a scientific journal and we hope somebody reads it. And the evidence on this is that the average social science article, the mean social science article in a refereed academic journal indexed in the ICI, which is already better than some of them, is 0.9 citations ever. Right? So hoping somebody reads it is a good thing because you can't count on it. And so if we believe in this, we would have a different relationship to the public. That would include the high-quality research that gets published in articles. It would include co-production of knowledge with social movements, with people in government, and in other settings, a sort of interaction from the beginning that created interest in the research, which I think has gone on. I won't, it's a favorite point of mine, but I'm going to shut up about it. But let me give an example of it, which is the history of the women's movement. And I don't know, again, the Brazilian story as much. This could be false to Brazil. But the history of the women's movement in Europe and the US was of an extremely close interconnection between intellectuals, including academic intellectuals, and social movements through the early phase in the 60s, 70s of so-called second wave feminism and all of this. And the connections between movement activism and academic feminist research have been much, not completely, but significantly broken. And this is now an academic specialty without the close relationships to the movements. It's poorer. The movements and the academics are both poorer as a result of that. And I think we could say the same thing in other fields. And this sort of thing, it seems to me, is very important.
I'm Carolina I work for the British government here in São Paulo. And you kind of already answered my question. I was going to ask, how can we work closely with research funding agency and government representatives to increase the funding available for social sciences? How can social scientists show the impact of their research to those funding agencies?
I did talk about it a little bit. I mean, the whole thing is, in a way, an attempt to suggest the importance of this, but the importance of us improving what we do, as well as just asking for more money. And what I will add to it is the other thing that I think we have to do is recognize the extent to which our research is paid for by our teaching, and be serious about our teaching. I think that social science, partly imitating some parts of physical science and a little bit natural science, has often imagined an ideal in which release from teaching makes research possible. And I think that's a dangerous ideal for the future of social science. First, we're not going to get enough money from outside agencies for that to be true. Most social scientists are going to continue to be employed as academics. But secondly, it deprives us of one of our biggest forms of public communication and actual impact, which is the work we do in the education of students. And we ought to be striving for excellence in that, not only excellence in our publication records.
Well, if I look at the information that was provided to us about your background, I would say, and I think about the presentation you made, that you actually have in your previous life done a lot of what you're talking about in your social science manifesto. So it seems that if you have eaten the pudding. And I wonder, you know, how much involvement there is in all that you've presented to us, the question of innovation. It seems to be that what you have been trying to say to us is that social science have to innovate. And the environment you described to us is one that is not very favorable to innovation, you know. The departmental structure of the universities, the kind of incentives that are generated for individual researchers, everything goes against the tide of innovation. But I have a feeling, personally, that if social science doesn't innovate, and to do that, it has to break the barriers of the disciplines. It has to become truly interdisciplinary, you know. It has to dare, you know. It's going to be a tough task. So, you know, This is what I would like to hear, what your thoughts about it.
Unfortunately, I agree with you completely. I wish I could say, no, it's going to be easy and I'm not worried about it. It will challenge vested interests. It will challenge people to move outside of their comfort zone, because we're each comfortable in the discussions we know, where we've read the work that is referenced, where we understand the methods, and we're less comfortable when we move into a different area. So we may agree that climate change is a huge issue, but in fact become uncomfortable because it demands knowledge of some things we don't know about. You know, the same for any of a variety of other themes. So I do think it calls on us to do that, and it will be hard. It calls on us to do it in institutions that are already under lots of pressure, and that will be hard. So it's easier to innovate and be flexible when you're well-funded and growing, and harder when you're under pressure and attack. And I think that makes the challenge more difficult as well. The last point on it, though, is it was partly a call for social science to innovate, partly a statement that social science was important to all these other agendas on which we need innovation. And I would add, innovation is a social process. Innovation is not a technological process alone. It can be socio-technical. Technology can be mobilized in these relationships, but it is very crucially a social process. And therefore, if society is going to innovate, it also needs what we potentially have to offer. And that's a responsibility for us, but it's also, in relation to the previous question, one of the reasons that there should be support for making this happen.
Thank you. Actually, my question is a more specific version of the previous one. I am particularly concerned with your point about the separation among the different social science disciplines. And I agree that department change and perhaps more integration of the departments is a major step in the direction of improving the social sciences. And particularly as an economist, I'm especially concerned with that, unlike most of my colleagues in my profession.
You come visit the LSE and
so my specific question is, what do you think can be and should be made in order to change the divisions among the departments and to overcome the challenges posed, for example, by the vested interests of the faculty members and things like that?
I think we should overcome secularism and return to prayer. But in the absence of divine intervention on this front, a couple of other thoughts. One is to remember that departments were not established at the same time as the Ten Commandments. They are not an ancient and eternal thing. They are a structure that has been put in place in certain conditions. The LSE is very distinctive on this. Departments became the mode of organizing the LSE in the 1960s. And so fairly recently, the primary modes of budgets and tenure and all this sort of thing. That's a particular story, but it is a reminder that's useful. And there are other places where they're 100 years old, but there are no places where they're 200 years old. None. All right, so being human creations, they can be changed by people. Now, how to go about this? One thing is just have departments and try to encourage perspectives with more interrelation to others. And your comments on economics are welcome. Economics has been the field in the social science most visibly prone to autism in recent years, but it has not been unique to economics. I've actually done the citation and counting empirical research to show that in pretty much across the social sciences, the rate of citation to work from other disciplines has gone down in every discipline, in all of the leading American journals. So in the sociology example of it, looking at the American Sociological Review and the American Journal of Sociology, over a 40-year period, there's a secular decline. The decline starts, like so many things in my story, in the 1970s, and it goes down, the rate of citation. Now, which disciplines change, right? So anthropology disappears. It used to be a very frequently cited discipline for sociologists. Economics grows, a bit more important, but the real thing is insularity dominates more. It's partly because the fields got bigger, other things happened. But you get my point, that I think there's an issue about what we do even within our disciplines. Then there's the issue of interdisciplinary work, where I signaled, I think that strategically, the best thing to do is to create arenas of work where we want to understand something and need each other. So what I call problem-oriented work is an example. I think that it's almost impossible to achieve interdisciplinary approaches by talking about having interdisciplinary approaches. What you get are people talking about, well, we do this, and others say, well, we do that, and they each leave thinking what they do is better, and it just is very hard. Where you get interdisciplinary collaboration is where there is something that people in common agree they want to understand. Take inequality, where there's a recognition, first, that inequality is important, secondly, that it may have been intensified in recent years, and third, that there are really multiple inequalities bundled in that concept. Then if you want to try to understand this, you will, of course, read Thomas Piketty and the current celebrity of economic work, an LSE PhD, I might add, on this, and that's a source. You'll recognize that it had intersections with sociology, and distinctively among economists, he actually cites sociologists, and there's a basis, partly because the empirical research that he wanted to draw on was done partly by sociologists and partly by economic historians. So it gives a new place to economic history. So you get reaching out. Now, others working on inequality will say, you know, he doesn't deal with gender. He doesn't deal with countries outside the OECD. He doesn't deal with this, right? So a common object of trying to understand, you will use sources and you will enter conversations. So my bet as an administrator, if you will, and where I'd put resources is in enabling people to pursue research where they either want to use the same data sources or they want to understand the same problem. Then I think they're motivated to try to find ways to work together. That's a very pragmatic response. That's not a theoretical model of vision of the different social science, but it's what I would say can complement the disciplinary structures, which do some things well but don't do this very well, with things like that. The other thing I would say, though, and I said it very much in passing, is the organization of social science in this respect is different in most countries or regions. And there is a value to internationalization in this. There are other values to internationalization for other purposes, but there's a value in the fact that the configuration of the disciplines is different in different places, and that helps also the researchers who come together to discuss with each other. Even if they don't form partnerships and do collaborative research, even if they just talk regularly, it helps them see the possibilities of different configurations of knowledge.
Oh, Professor Calhoun, thank you once again for the very enlightening talk and for the discussion. Thank you all for being here. Thank you.